Hi everyone, welcome to the Community Classroom. This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator. We're going to quickly be addressing the issue of federal power versus state power, which means we're going to be looking at jurisdiction. Now, we've talked about jurisdiction before, but we're going to have a little bit more specificity with this very brief conversation. Now, this conversation is divided into two parts. We're going to just start off with what is federal power. So that you understand that there are distinctions between federal power and state power, and then those different levels of government. And so we're going to address that, and then we're going to touch on this construct of lawlessness, because that is a part of the discussion, the public discussion that is being had. And so we're going to address very discreetly federal power in this discussion, and then we're going to look at some dynamics, biblical dynamics related to this idea of lawlessness, which addresses some of the things that we're going to be talking about. What is noted about this current situation is that the underpinning of all of it is boundary violation. Whether you're talking about the science or whether you're talking about the law, you see boundary violations. And so boundaries are about where one thing begins and another thing ends, that limit around something. And so there have been lots of violations going on. And you can look at this from the level of the microbe to the level of the actual practice of science, to the actual crossing of the line from science over into the art of medicine. And so that boundary has been violated. You see boundary violations with respect to the law. You see boundary violations with respect to jurisdiction, specifically in law. Who has what power to do what, when, where, and how? And so that has become very murky. And many people don't study the law, even the basic law, the Constitution. And so therefore they don't always know when these boundaries have been crossed, but there has been quite a bit of boundary crossing. And so you need to understand what the boundaries are. We're just going to have a very rudimentary discussion about this. We're going to now review some of the things we've talked about related to jurisdiction in the past. So you recall that you have the local, state, and federal levels of power. And then within them, you have legislative functions, judicial functions, and executive functions. What you see in terms of the current situation, for the most part, you see conflict at the executive level, for the most part. And so you see some conflict between the state executives and the federal executives, chiefly the chief executive officers at both of those levels. And you see this related to what are known as the executive orders. And so what appears to be happening is that there is a bit of overreach going on in some instances, where there may be a commandeering of power that may not actually belong to a particular level or branch of government. And let's look at that. We're just going to look at federal power right now so that you understand what is federal power in this system in which we operate. You hear a lot of people operating like they are in that song, they've got the power. What's interesting, however, is that the power within the United States is very distinct, and it's spelled out for the most part. And so you have federal versus state power. Federal power is very specific. It is constitutionally limited, and most people don't know that because they think that the federal government is the big power. However, the federal government is a very limited power. It's as if the governors are actually kings of their countries, and then the chief executive in terms of the federal branch is almost like an emperor, But those kings are the sovereigns for their respective states, and they have very specific powers. And the federal government has very specific powers. And so, what's important to keep in mind when you're looking at and you're hearing about all these debates is that the constitutional power of the federal government is limited. It's limited in terms of its power, it's limited in terms of its force, it is restricted. Now, you see some expansion of it more recently, and that's where the questions come in. And this expansion, is it constitutional or not? The other thing about federal power is that it is enumerated and delegated. That means it's specifically spelled out in the Constitution. And if it's not specifically spelled out in the Constitution, then the federal government probably doesn't have that power. And so it's arguable. But generally speaking, it's very specific. And so you need to keep that in mind, because you will hear people asserting power. But the question is, do they actually have the power that is being asserted? And so it's up to you to do your homework, to check to see each time, is the power that is asserted legitimate based upon the Constitution. Now, remember, we talked about this before, how the laws in the West primarily come from Scripture. And so there is a lot coming from Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that lawlessness, which is mentioned in Scripture, can take place in a number of ways. And so the lawlessness that people are noticing more recently is rooted in this assertion of rights or power that are not legitimate. They are not always legitimate. And that's that overreaching that you are seeing sometimes. And sometimes, just that expansion going across those boundaries. That also is an element of lawlessness, because it means that the law is not being respected. It means that the agreement, the legal agreement that we all have, is not being respected. And so those are the things that people are seeing, and that's where you see all of these contests, in terms of legal contests, coming up. It's about those questions related to whether someone actually has the legal authority based upon what the law says. And when someone is overreaching or acting as if they are above the law, then you have that spirit of lawlessness. And even though this is using a number of spiritual terms, you can see how this is related to the legal situations that we are seeing right now. And so you have a number of people, a number of entities asserting violations. And so that again goes into that idea of iniquity and transgression and boundary violation with respect to the law. And we want to leave with some food for thought. If the laws that are in place cannot be enforced, or people cannot actually assert rights that are enumerated, the question becomes whether you actually have law. And so if there is complete contempt for whatever law is in existence, or entities acting above the law and without respect for enumerated rights, you have a question of whether you actually have law or whether you have something else going on. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.